Hello and welcome to the End of the Chain. I am your host, Samuel McCullum. I'm joined again by Corey Petty. We said that we would have him back for another episode, and he's back to talk about status and also Ethereum gas prices. It was a fun conversation, to say the least. I hope you enjoy it. Make sure to leave 5 stars and make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Share it with friends, everybody else. All right, let's jump into the episode. Corey, welcome back to the End of the Chain. It's great to have you back. I would say that things are overall better in the world than the last time that we spoke.
Arguably.
Actually, I'm really surprised at how much has happened in the past 5 weeks. So we spoke on April 22nd of last month. And during that time, apparently we all forgot about the coronavirus and have moved on to other issues concerning police violence and other racial issues inside the United States. And it feels like everybody was just bored at home for months and months and months. And all of a sudden, just this internal need to break out of the house and break some things has kind of taken over the American populace.
Yeah, it's an interesting time we're living in. I think what you just said, people staying at home, cooped up, not really knowing how to react, a lot of uncertainty probably bled into that kind of explosion of kind of getting out and doing stuff. Unfortunately, it seems as though it's doing it in a negative way.
Well, where are you?
I'm in Maryland. I live in the woods, so I tend to keep away from most people most of the time.
I know. I mean, I live in the suburbs, and I'm kind of happy I live in the suburbs and not in the city anymore, because even living in Moscow previously, there's protests and police and things. But I guess at this point, I would much rather live out in the woods somewhere. My wife wouldn't. She would kill me if I took her out to the country. But it's something that I think about going forward.
It's something I've always wanted, and my wife was reluctant at first and came into it pretty quickly after we moved. And I think we'll probably never go back. Plus, having things like dogs and stuff, it's nice to have your own space and not really worry about kind of the boundaries around you too much.
Mm-hmm. During these protests, there's been a lot of coordination through either social media or different messenger platforms to direct a lot of the either protests or violent response towards businesses and other property and other government buildings across the country. I know that just recently Trump came out and declared Antifa a domestic terrorist organization, which has there's a really great article by Preston Brin who wrote quite a bit about what it means to be a domestic versus foreign terrorist organization and how they are treated by different businesses and about how they're able to exist within different institutions and banking structures and things. But the ability for them to coordinate their meetings with, like Facebook and other messengers, supposedly like Twitter and stuff, I guess has really been brought to the forefront. And, it's worrying really that a lot of the time you have a strong response by the government towards who they claim are either terrorists or violent protesters or other people, and then they use that as an excuse to curtail the rights of everyone and to place increased restrictions on the companies providing those communication services to the general public. And I think that even though I may not agree with what a lot of these groups are doing, it's still worrying for me to see what the response will be to these types of actions over the next few months. It's good then that Status has its ability to remain encrypted and remain decentralized, that Status really can stay above it all.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no way for us to inject authority into other people's conversations based on how we built it. We could, of course, change the application that we distribute and we build from open source, but that is only a layer on top of the protocol, and anyone else can just choose to not use our application and build their own using the protocol to get around any type of maybe decision we choose to do. We have no real intention at this moment to do anything like that, but it's always a possibility, right? But we've made it in such a way that if someone doesn't like the decisions we make, they have the freedom to go and build their own and do it the way they feel it should be done. And I think you're right. Like, even though we may not agree with all the things that are happening and why they're happening, or have conjectures about why they're happening, it's I guess history has shown that decisions that are made to curtail these things by governmental bodies tend to never be given back after that power is taken to curtail whatever they're trying to get rid of. And that usually means giving up privacy and security of the jurisdictions they control in exchange for something, like the ability to do that type of stuff. I mean, look at and from my perspective, it's usually done in the name of terrible acts. We're trying to protect you from these bad guys. Name the bad guys, make it so heinous that no one's ever going to argue with you. And in the process of saying, yeah, let's stop those bad guys, like a lot more control is taken into the things that people use every day. Like, look at the Earn It Act as an example of this. We recently had a Forbes article that kind of dove into this, like how this process happens in the name of how it happens, and kind of the like being weary of the consequences in the process of actual like trauma and triage happening. Like, don't get me wrong, like the stuff that's happening in the United States right now is traumatic, and other things that are happening across the globe are also traumatic, and they need to be addressed somehow by the governing bodies that like oversee the people who live there. But you have to be cognizant of when that stuff happens, if they're changing regulation and rules, or making backdoors into encryption, or like further increasing the amount of surveillance on the people so that they can try and find this stuff. Like, when the problem is gone, the ability remains. And if it's still there, people they at least have the option to choose it in a way that it wasn't intended for in the first place. And I don't think people quite think about that when they're quick to try and solve a problem that's happening right now. Like that further thinking, I don't think happens because of the like potential heinousness or unsavory aspect of what's going on at the moment.
And coming back to the Earn It Act, that was a bill put forward recently in January that would give the committee, the Senate committee, the ability to make wide sweeping reforms and rules for online platforms. And would that cover a platform like Status as well too?
I think it remains to be seen whether it covers a platform like Status. The way I understood it, they were never specific about what they would do, but it definitely opened the door to introducing backdoors. And the person who put it forward has been notorious for looking for encryption backdoors and not liking strong encryption. And so like what it did was say, like, it made a selection of best practices for online bodies to follow pretty much mandatory by not giving them the ability to have a lot of the regulatory safety measures that are allowed to them unless they did these best practices. So it made a suggested set into a mandatory set, and then the ability to change what that set is, which could potentially turn into something like introduce a backdoor to your encryption algorithm so that we always have access if we need it. At least that's my interpretation of like what the whole bill was about, or the act was about. And that's one of those situations where they did it in the name of heinous things that no one's going to agree with, like child pornography. But the broad sweeping consequences of what that can do and the control that gives to the government is drastically larger than that. In my opinion, the scope of what they really wanted to do was probably drastically larger than what they're trying to advertise it as. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just one instance of a history of attempts to have more easily accessible power when you need it. Like if you look at the way large government bodies act in accordance with one another across, like, not with just their own jurisdiction but also across the globe, it's it's a constant vie for an advantageous position wherever you can possibly have it, so that when you need to use it, you have surgical precision to use so. And the lengths that people will go to just get the position, I think is never, it has no limit. Doesn't mean that it's going to be done or be used, but it's a jockeying position, a constant jockeying position. And the more you ease up on the technologies that you use, and like introducing backdoors and encryption, the more you allow that limit to be pushed further and further and further. So, like, as a company, Status just maintains a hard position that we're not going to introduce those things. And the way the new web should be built in such a way where it's not even possible to do certain types of things, so that this constant battle for jockeying just can't push certain boundaries. It's always going to be constrained somewhere, at least in terms of like the technology being used.
I think looking back on it, in the wake of 9/11, I think the government probably felt it had been caught flat-footed on the intelligence side. And while most of the changes that they made to prevent another 9/11 from happened actually on the physical security of going through the airports and getting checked, and also adding locks to the planes as well too, probably had a bigger impact. The ability of the intelligence agencies post 9/11 really was second guessed and then ramped up to kind of meet a foe which they thought they knew, but were outsmarted really by a couple of guys with box cutters, and they probably had all the information, but they just overlooked it. I see now that 20 years on, they probably feel that they never want to be in that place again, to be outwitted and not to have any sort of idea of an attack of that scale happening inside the United States again. Whether it means they overstep their bounds in protecting the security of the American state and also protecting it from foreign enemies, it's really a debate that's not happening publicly. I'm sure there's a lot of back and forth between Google and Facebook and other companies and the intelligence and American government. When you have programs like Signal, and when you have programs like Status, I think that there is a threat that they see in really the unknown of what could be done, and the ability for them to be caught flat-footed again. And I think it really scares them a lot. And I think there's also this backlash that's happening right now, that's happening on the front pages. I think it's more of a way to distract people from what's going on with COVID, with the whole Section 230. But that's also closely tied in with the Internet Act as well too, of reducing or removing the liability of social media platforms and other online platforms when it comes to user-generated content. And it's kind of all tied in together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because if a platform like Status is responsible for the type of content that's passed between its users, really there can be no security then, because there has to be a group or some sort of machine or something that's maintaining the acceptable speech on the platform. And so while a company like Facebook or maybe even a Google can do these things because of their ability to survey their users, and then also have the machine learning capabilities to read those texts and understand it and quickly retaliate and ban people who are engaging in non-acceptable behavior that doesn't meet their platform rules. I mean, they're able to do it, but it's really like smaller platforms who don't have these, or platforms that have full encryption like yours, which would suffer. They have the ability to comply by adding different, text reading features. They can read all their messages by all their users and look at all the pictures and have these huge content moderation teams that are picking out different types of images or content or video, and then banning it, right? And then they can also make sure that no other type of content is being shared on their platform that would not meet their terms of service. But a smaller platform may have more problems like that.
Yeah, that's generally true. The way I kind of see it is, it depends on what you're focused on as an organization. We, as an organization, spend a good portion of our focus and priority and resources on building open protocols that don't belong to us. And much to the way like TCP/IP, how we use the internet today and the protocols that deliver information to each other across the globe, and in a myriad of contexts is used. That doesn't really belong to anyone, but those who build on top of it then have the ability to change things as needed. And in that sense, like in an end-to-end encrypted scheme for messaging, where can you censor? How deep in the stack can you possibly go to change something? And what we're trying to do is make it so that like the only people that can change the things are the people who are reading the messages, and maybe the application that they use that talks with the underlying protocol. So for instance, at Status, like, sure, we as an organization could change the application, like the actual mobile application or desktop application when that's ready, to like use machine learning to look for certain types of cues or certain types of content or conversations that happen in certain types of channels, and selectively choose to block that or just not render it when a message runs through the pipeline. But the underlying protocol is completely open. It's just a bunch of dumb pipes. You just can't see inside the pipes. They're completely opaque.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were to be able to see inside the pipes, you wouldn't be able to differentiate between all the different stuff running through them. And it's very important that those pipes, the underlying protocol, the network of message passing, stays unconstrained. And so if something happens, people can maybe come at Status. They can maybe ask us to do something to comply with a certain jurisdiction, or try and get us to understand like what's going on based on whatever metadata we can pull from those pipes.
Yeah.
And that's a reasonable solution. But like we as a company should not have control over something that should be used, a protocol that should be used on how you communicate with others securely and privately. We as a company should only be involved, like, or have access to like the applications we distribute that leverage those things. And so that's why we spend most of our resources on making sure that those pipes are really good, the infrastructure, the ability to do that, and those can provide potential functionalities and applications for others to do what they need to do with available technology. And we'll build something that uses them. Yeah. And when you look at the people who have that generally broad access, that's not the mentality that they have. They want to own from top to bottom and as far wide and as far as horizontally as they can go, because that gives them complete full control over everything. And if they have that, then they can do whatever they want. And then they have the obligation to not do bad things or to comply or to fix things in whatever jurisdiction they provide service to. We don't want that power. That doesn't belong to us.
I would stress that a lot of companies want encryption, and a lot of companies want to be able to securely encrypt their data. But there seems to be certain sectors of our online life which the government says, okay, well, these people can have encryption and should have it. So if you're running a company and you need to send encrypted emails, especially if you're in like the defense industry or something like that, you would never have backdoors built into your messaging platform. And so, you would want a extremely secure messaging platform to be able to handle emails and text and other things in the case that there is some sort of foreign government that would be listening in. But at the same point, there's almost this double standard where if you're not a government supported industry, that you have to give up your privacy in the name of safety. And it's strange, really. Yeah, it's really strange.
I would agree. I feel like that exchange you just mentioned, giving something up in the name for security, or like giving up your privacy in the name for security or convenience, is a relic of how we've built things in the past. I really do hope that the ideals of Web3 and how we build it are done in such a way that that's no longer the case. Like you don't have, like it's not a implicit exchange, and you have to find some balance in between. You should still have convenience with full security and privacy. Because let's be honest, like the technology is there. It exists. The cat's out of the bag. And if we don't develop strong standards and strong infrastructure and a very common knowledge of what's capable and what is used based on the like nonstop increase in the power of our technology, then someone's going to use it, and there's not going to be enough people with enough information to stop them in the ways that they can. And like, let's take, for instance, like the like canonical example of nuclear power. Like once that's out of the bag, like it's a tool. It's something that exists, that anyone can use with the appropriate resources, that you can't undo. You can't put it back. And it's one of those situations where it can be used for incredibly good things that help people's lives in a lot of ways and progress civilization and humanity, or incredibly bad things and do the exact opposite. And if you pretend like it doesn't exist, the people who want to do bad things don't really care. They're just going to keep doing it. They're going to try to gain those resources. And if you have full understanding, you can then see what it looks like to get to the point where you become a problem, like how resources are gained, where they exist, all the peripheral things around the technology. But you can't stop the technology. And that's we haven't made that transition with digital technology and the overwhelming power it gives the defender that doesn't exist anywhere else. And so, like in my opinion, you need to build things and let them be freely accessible so that you're not trying to use a hammer to do a job that a hammer isn't good for. Because that's what people are doing when they try to say, oh, we need to introduce backdoors into encryption so that we can maintain this power we've always had. That's not how it works. The technology's out of the bag. Your ability to do those types of things is going to go away. And if you try and enforce it on the people that you control, the people you're trying to stop won't care. They're going to go around and use it anyway because the technology exists and it's open source and it's going to get better. And I think it's just a terrible way to try to move forward because you're ultimately shooting yourself in the foot because you're going to remain ignorant on how things actually work of the things you're trying to stop.
I want to move on to the next topic for today, which has been the Ethereum network has been extremely congested for the past couple months. And it's been because of several Ponzi schemes which have been operating on top of Ethereum. Most notably, there's one called SCADA, which has been spending thousands of ETH worth of gas every single month to power their Ponzi smart contract. And it really sucks. When gas prices, it's terrible. When gas prices are in the 20s for days, like days and days, and then like spiking up into the 50s and 60s for a couple hours at a time, it really renders the network almost useless. And especially for dealing with smart contracts and higher or more complex, more gas intensive computations that need to take place on chain, it's horrible. And I've really been having to rethink a lot of how a business would operate on top of Ethereum in the past couple of weeks, simply because the the gas fees are so unpredictable in this case that you if you're budgeting for like 1 to 7 gas fees and all of a sudden you're paying like 20 and then sometimes 50 to have normal business operations, it just can't continue. It just eats into your revenue and eats into your profits and kills your margins. So how does a company supposed to grow and thrive in an environment like that? And especially for smart contract developers, where to test their contracts, they need to put them on chain and spend maybe hundreds of dollars to pay for gas fees to do the dev work. How is a company supposed to survive in that kind of environment?
It's kind of multifold here. I'm not the best at smart contract development, but I've certainly understood the architecture and foundations of how these things are built and kind of the consequences. And I hate to say it, it's somewhat of a trope, but like the technology is incredibly nascent. It's very new. We're just learning how to do this properly, and we're fumbling our way through on how to really build incentivized peer-to-peer networks. And it's very hard to predict these things, I think, because it's one of those situations where you can build a bucket, and that bucket may have holes in it, but you're really not going to know about those holes until you fill the bucket up. We saw that happen with Bitcoin. And we realized like how the fee structure and congestion of the network changes with demand. And then you saw a lot of the solutions turn to a second layer, which offloads some of that requirement for certain types of transactions to be on chain. In most circumstances, you don't need to buy coffee with a globally secured, permissionless, auditable, like forever network. And so it makes you wonder, like, what are blockchains good for? And when we first introduced the concept of like permissionless global ledgers, it was one of those situations where like, oh, well, let's just make everything a permissionless global layer. All things belong on this. This is a way better way of doing it. And then we went full swing to one side, and it's like, well, there's a lot of stuff that isn't really amenable to this type of like technology. In reality, like it's somewhere in the middle, depending on what you're doing and what risk is associated with it, or how much trust you have in the parties involved, et cetera. Or like what kind of time sensitivity it may have, or how much you can project into the future in terms of costs and stuff like that. And so like that's one real side of this. This technology is new. We're learning as we go. And it takes a while for us to learn some lessons because it requires a certain amount of activity and value for like these things that come to light, for that to find that hole in the bucket that leaks. And the second one is like, I think like part of that is we're starting to have a little better realization on what types of applications and types of business logic belong on a chain. What should you be doing this stuff with? And then the circumstances where it's not really appropriate for blockchain, how do you tie one in? How do you root yourself into it? And we're just now starting to see different types of concepts in how you root certain types of business logic or a business into a blockchain that leverages the things that it's good for. And on the other hand, like people are getting smarter about how they make their businesses. We're starting to develop best practices around how to optimize gas, how to make smart contracts that do what you want them to do, but aren't inefficient. And what are the security catch-alls? How do you make it so that you can upgrade them when something like this happens? How do you potentially offload gas, like buy it when it's low and use it when it's high? Like the whole concept of meta transactions was like, we can use the security of the blockchain, but not actually spend any gas for certain types of activities. And we're still playing with that stuff too. And so as we keep learning these different ways of like operating our business and changing it to deal with these issues that we're having, as well as building the infrastructure in a way that has a lot of different tools that you can mix and match to do what you need to do for your business, we're learning a lot of lessons. And we have a long way to go. And the fact that like one business's activities can affect the entire network is maybe a lesson learned that we didn't see coming. Like the to the extent that like a Ponzi scheme can basically cripple the network. We saw it with CryptoKitties, but we're still learning. We haven't scaled any from CryptoKitties, and the naivety of the people who are doing like the imp or whatever scams that are currently like pushing up fees, it ruins it for everyone. And so that architectural decision probably isn't a good one. We need to find a better way to do it. And I think those conversations are being had now on how do we make this work better in the future. So that one, if someone does drastically raise fees, the community benefits from the fees that are generated in somehow. Like that redistribution of the cost that that company is paying is equitable to the community. Or make it so they can't do it. So like maybe I guess for F2, this would be one shard. It doesn't affect other shards. Or other platforms where like you have a separation of state and consensus.
Mm-hmm.
And I think these are just conversations to be had that we need to learn from because we're so young. And it's I don't have the solution for it. I can just see kind of where the problems exist.
I mean, would Status have any of these scaling issues?
We're affected by it, but not to the extent that most blockchain applications are. We have features that allow you to do certain things. It's like, let me give you a perspective of Status, right? We're a company that allows like you to have a wallet, interact with decentralized applications, and chat. The chat itself has nothing to do with Ethereum. It's completely separated. It's a completely separate message passing network that has nothing to do with Ethereum. We say that it uses Ethereum because it was built off of one of the prongs of the Ethereum trifecta, which was data, blockchain, and storage, blockchain, and messaging. And the messaging was called Whisper. So we built an entire messaging passing network separate from Ethereum, leveraging that software and that protocol. And then we built from there. And then we give access to Ethereum by allowing you to kind of access decentralized applications from the wallet, use the same type of cryptography. So it's very easy to kind of add that functionality over time. And then have like feature ads within the application that make the chat experience more fun. For instance, like ENS usernames. You can choose to purchase a username or like stake 10 S&T. So it's almost not even purchasing. You're staking S&T for a unique username that allows you to be more discoverable and have an easier to find username in the chat context. So a feature like that, which costs a certain amount of gas, starts to become kind of difficult to use when the price of purchasing it is vastly more expensive than maybe the kind of value add of the network, right? And so that's what dApps kind of experience. They have like, oh, we kind of planned out this feature or this functionality. It should cost this amount to do, and it actually adds value back in the network by this much. When fees rise, that like economic understanding and like balance is completely skewed. And so it becomes intractable to do certain types of things. And so maybe eventually we'll have a better solution. Say if fees don't go away, we're gonna have to come up with a better solution to add the same functionality in like a layer 2 or off chain or something else that provides a very similar user experience and it's very similar security and privacy experience, but doesn't require you to go directly on chain because maybe that's not a good use of being directly on chain.
I would say that with layer 2, there's a lot of systemic risk because you're moving users away from making trustless transactions. So the further they get away from layer 1, the less they're incorporated into using all of the things that make the base layer so great. So the further they get away, they may not get access to those same level of features and trustlessness and security. And that would deprive them of the abilities and the characteristics that make the layer 1 chain so great.
I may want to push back on that a little bit. You're right. Anytime you change or move away, you definitely change the risk structure. There's always something you're giving up, but potentially something you're adding. And it is has heavily to do with the implementation of whatever you're doing. There's no like each layer 2 solution is not the same in any way, shape, or form. And in some cases, they add a tremendous amount of benefit. Like, say, for
But
instance,
you're
introducing zero knowledge proofs.
but you're moving into a almost like a walled garden when you go into these layer 2 solutions where the the you're no longer able to interact with the rest of the network in the same way. Is that you're stuck in this small little layer 2 area where you can do one specific thing, and then if you do want to come back and interact with the network, you have to come back on chain.
Yeah, right. That's always going to be the case, and maybe eventually that barrier to flow through layer 2 to layer 1 to another layer 2 is more efficient and minimized, so that it happens almost as seamlessly as just using the base layer itself. I don't know. Like, I don't know where the technology is going to go that allows that type of communication. Like, think about shard to shard communication in Ethereum 2. Like, that's going to be difficult. It's not as similar as operating on the same shard in any sharded experience.
Mm-hmm.
And layer 2 is no different. Plasma is a very similar situation, but maybe it's useful in the context of whatever you need to do. And you use the chain when you need to use the chain, because you still have that option. That's the main thing that I think we're providing. Like, we're providing different options for technology and always the ability to opt out. That's the main thing here, is that, like, in a previous circumstance in traditional web, you don't have the option to opt out if you don't like it, because you can
Mm-hmm.
always do the same stuff on chain. It just may cost you more if you need that security or trustlessness. But most relationships are not trustless. Like, you can build, I guess, quote unquote, walled gardens or like reduced trust and privacy, but it's still tremendously better than previous applications. And if it works, that's the difficulty of the application developers and organizations that are building things that provide services to end users. They need to balance these things and come up with something that people agree with, so that, like, when they do something and it's operated the way they want it to, if they don't, they can opt out, but it's still, like, economically feasible to do so, or feasible in whatever privacy and security demands they need. But they have options.
You would choose the level of security that you would need, whether it's full on chain trustless security or operating within your own private structure, and then you're just writing data, writing hashes to the main chain or to the layer 1 chain to ensure that the data that you're putting forth in your private transact or in your private network matches what's being written on the layer 1.
Let me give you an example here of, like, this in practice as it currently stands today within the blockchain ecosystem, and that's gaming. Gaming is introducing the concept, or gaming with blockchain technology is introducing the concept of actually generating real world value from human effort into a game, right? But the difficulty that they face is scale. Like, you can't operate most games directly on chain and have any type of real world user experience that can be on par with, like, regular games, and people are going to play them. It has stickiness, and people, like, invest their time and get involved, and so on and so forth. You can't have that right now. The technology just can't do it. We're not there yet. We will be, but we're not there yet. So what they end up doing is they virtualize that environment on top. It's basically a layer 2 in a walled garden, but it operates by the exact same rules, just within a walled garden. And so what happens is that you end up playing the game. It's fun. It's enjoyable. You're having a good time. You get invested into it, and you invest a lot of your human hours into it. And you end up developing, like, still scarce resources within that walled garden. And once they get to a certain value, you say, well, I don't want to take this off. I'm done playing the game. I want to take this money out and sell it. That's when you take it on chain. So you can sell it in an open market, where that's something you could never do before. And that's really, really awesome. And until the open and permissionless technology gets to a point where you don't need that virtualization, it's a really good way to do it, because it's still changing what you could do in the past and allowing people to opt out and take their value that they've generated and earned somewhere else, not within a walled garden.
Yeah, that's a really great example. I like that.
Yeah, I think, and then if you think about gaming in general, that's the real playground for technological innovation. That's where you are able to deal like to experiment with different types of economic situations and rules and games and how people interact with them and how they can game them, like mechanism, like the interplay between mechanism design and game theory, right? You're able to do this in less risky, viable situations that allow you to develop really, really robust methods and tried and true ways of doing something that have real outcomes because people are really wanting to do these things over time, which builds standards for more game changing, world impacting enterprises to take that stuff and run with it. So, for instance, I think the supply chain is going to take a lot of what we've learned from gaming NFTs and implement it into ways to making like how we track sourcing to moving to building to manufacturing to delivering things and make it incredibly more efficient and auditable and easy for us to kind of understand what we're using and where it came from and who put effort into that process. But that came from the fact that we're able to kind of play around with this stuff and figure out how to do it. And we're still playing around with it.
There's a lot of creativity that goes into game design and the ability to have these like sandbox environments where you can design certain structures and rules for people to operate in. And then you can take those ideas and then transition it back towards more real world examples.
Sorry if I went on a tangent there. I've always found that concept really interesting. And I think that like blockchains and smart contracts is the first time we've been able to like really, really, really play and experiment with like actual economics and where value lies and what the exchange rate is between various types of human effort and relationships and value, and then how you exchange it for other types. And in a lot of ways, like the decentralized exchanges and the things we're building on top are like giving us an emergent behavior of what that looks like.
I think it's probably a good place to wrap up on, because I really like that point. And I really like the idea of bringing game structures into, bigger financial applications and having a small sandbox to kind of use to develop into bigger ideas and fine tune them for actual use.
If you're interested in what we do, you can always download Status in your app store or from the website, and get on and ask questions and find us. I'm Petty, Petty. Come ask me questions, and we're here to help.
When is desktop application coming for Status?
It's in a work in progress. We've been playing around with kind of what tech stack we want to use to build it, so that we have kind of good security guarantees of the technology that we rely on. And it's actively being developed and worked on, and we hope to have it out. I mean, I can't give you a date. It's one of those situations where like we have a lot to do because it can be a lot of potential. And so what we call an alpha or a beta or a production app may change over the time period, but it's certainly getting moved on and progressing forward. You can follow it in the repos and download it at your will, but nothing we can really like actively broadcast and talk about.
Yeah, that's fine. I just, I work from my computer for most of the day, and having to switch back and forth between my like phone and my PC or my Mac means that I always like to have a desktop client.
Oh, I'm right there with you. Like, oh man, I'm so excited for this. I've been following them nonstop because I spend 95% of my day on a desktop.
Yeah. Well, cool. I want to thank you for coming back on. You're a repeat guest. Congratulations.
Look at me. I've really enjoyed it. I'm glad you brought me back on.
I'm gonna have to get you a mug or something. Well, great, Court. Let's wrap it up then. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.